One of the most important skills if you want to get really good at identifying birds and to do it in a way that doesn't require a huge amount of thought process, like getting it to the point where you can identify a bird like in the snap of a fingers, where it's just an instantaneous process. One of the most important things that we can do in order to get that skill is to learn the birds by ear. There's a few really important advantages to being able to identify birds by sound. For one thing, if you can identify a bird by sound, you can do that for much longer distances. The bird can really be on the other side of the forest, and if you know how to identify it, then you know what bird is over there. It instantly just gives you so much more information about the forest. The other thing is, it takes a lot less time to identify birds by sound than it does by sight. It maybe takes a little more time to learn the skill, but if you actually do learn the skill, it just gives you so much more. I talk about it as like fluency in the forest, like naturalist fluency, being able to look at things and listen to things and experience things in the forest and know it in the snap of a fingers what is actually going on there. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. The thing that I have experienced is that most people, when they go to try and learn bird identification by sound, typically they try to do it the hard way. The hard way is to, go into the forest and you hear some mystery bird off in the distance and you're like, oh, what is that bird? And you're listening and you're trying to remember what it sounds like. Maybe you're writing down in a notebook little mnemonic devices and you're trying to listen and figure it out, maybe try and get closer and see it. But in almost every case, you don't actually get to see the bird, and it either flies away or it's just in this position that you just can't get in there. And so you end up going home and then trying to look it up on the internet. You're listening to like bird CDs and just trying to find the bird from your memory. And by the time you get into the sounds, a lot of the times the memory is gone. You can't really remember it as clearly. You're like, it was kind of whistly, but I don't really remember the specifics now. So what I want to share with you in this video is that there's a much easier way to learn the birds by ear. And I like to call this learning the birds backwards. One of the things we have to remember is that most of the birds that you hear in the forest are going to be common birds. That's just the nature of the fact that they're common. And if you, rather than focusing on the rare birds and the mystery birds and the really unusual things that sort of break the mold, if you instead focus on learning the most common birds first, most of the time when you go outside and you hear a bird making a sound in the forest and you want to know what it is, it's going to be one of the most common birds in your area. That's just the nature of the fact that it's common. If you don't already know the 4 or 5 most common birds in your area by sound, I would highly recommend learning those birds exhaustively before you go out and try to hear mystery birds and then find them by looking up their sounds. When I was first learning the birds, I went on to a website that I'll link to in the description of this video. It's called MacaulayLibrary.org, and there's other websites like this that they have a huge inventory of bird sounds, and you can go on there and you can look for pretty much any bird in the whole world, and it'll have all their songs, their calls, different types of calls that they make, alarm calls, and you kind of have to sort through it a bunch. You just go in there and grab a bunch of sounds from the bird that you want to learn, and this is what I did with the black-capped chickadee. I just grabbed a bunch of black-capped chickadee sounds and sort of cut them together into like a 15-20 minute audio track that I then listened to over and over and over again. So this is why I call it learning the birds backwards, because rather than starting from something that's a mystery, you start with something that's known and common. And you're going to have this bird. A lot of the times that you hear things in the forest, it's going to be this bird. And so you make a little loop of all their sounds, and you just listen to that bird over and over and over again. And so I made this little recording of the chickadees, and I listened to it every day. You can make it your alarm clock when you wake up in the morning. The sound that wakes you up is the black-capped chickadee, and it's their song, it's their calls, all the different variety of things. And you know how when you get like a song stuck in your head, and it's like a song that you really like, and it just starts playing and it's on a loop and you just can't get it out of there? That's what you want to do with the bird sounds. You want to play those bird sounds of that known species over and over and over again until you just get it inside your brain, and it's like it's almost playing on a loop as you're going about your day. And if you can do that with one bird, the most common bird in your area, you will never have trouble identifying that bird ever again in the forest. You get out in the forest, and anytime you hear that bird, you're going to know it instantly. So after you've done that with one bird, then you just go to the next most common bird. Maybe it's the American robin, and you just learn all the different calls and sounds of the American robin, put it on a loop, listen to it, 10, 15, 20 minutes a day when you're doing the dishes, doing your daily commute to work. There's all these sort of times when we don't really have other things going on, and we can just listen to something, and you just listen to it until it becomes a part of you. And do that with the most common birds in your area. And then you'll start to discover that a lot of those mystery birds that you're hearing out in the forest are actually the most common birds. And when you eventually do hear a bird that's outside of those very common birds, at least you can say, okay, I know it wasn't one of those most common birds because I know those birds. I know their song, I know their call, I know their alarm call, I know their territorial call, all these different sounds. It was not any of those. It's got to be something different. And you can use them as frame of reference too. You can say it sounded kind of like a goldfinch, but I know it wasn't a goldfinch because I've listened to goldfinches on a loop for hours and hours, and I've got that bird really, really down. I know it's not a goldfinch, but it's similar. And it's much easier to identify a mystery bird when you're starting from a place like that than if you're just describing it as like some tweets and whistles, which could describe like hundreds of birds. So that's what you do. You just learn the birds one by one, and you learn them backwards, starting from a known species, and grab the recordings, listen to them until they just get inside your mind at that really deep level. And it gets to the point where you no longer have to think about it. This is really important. This is like one of the most important things that I'm always trying to get across with my mentoring students, is you want to get your identification skills to the point where you don't have to think about it. And I think a lot of times we just don't realize how much brain space it takes up when you're not sure what something is. You might be like 90% certain that you know what a bird is, but that 10% of just like uncertainty, that 10% of doubt, that takes up so much brain space that it's really actually going to affect your awareness in the forest. You're not going to be able to hear other things. That one of the things that will happen as you learn the birds backwards, and you get to that point where you hear a bird off in the distance and you have instant recognition, your mind will become very quiet, and you suddenly, all that thinking that you were doing as you were trying to figure out that bird, trying to remember its sound, fumbling with your notebook, trying to write it down, fumbling with your binoculars, trying to see it closer, all of that distraction goes away, and you can just have your mind will become very quiet, and you know what it is. And what happens is your awareness can then expand beyond it. And you realize that beyond that mystery bird that was holding so much of your focus and so much of your attention, there's other stuff. There's other stuff further out that you were just not even aware of. You weren't even hearing it. It was all just being deleted in your sensory system because you had so much focus on that one bird. And so this is where our identification skills and having our identification skills at the snap of a finger it's like a meditative skill. If you get it to that deep level, it lets you get into a meditative state where your mind is quiet, your awareness is open, and you're hearing things further than you've ever heard before. You're perceiving things deeper than you've ever perceived before. And that is something that just has to be experienced in order to know what I'm talking about. But it will make such a huge difference to everything you do in the forest, whether you're tracking, whether you're interested in bird language or going around and foraging. If you never have to worry about trying to identify the most common birds by sound, that will just take such a huge load off your plate, that you will have so much more freedom, so much more awareness to work with. And it gets to the point where, you can be tracking, you can be foraging and building a shelter and all this kind of stuff. And a bird will call way off in the distance, like at the outer range of your ability to hear, and you'll know that there's a robin there, or you'll know that there's a flock of chickadees feeding nearby, and you'll be able to hear it when they change their behavior and start mobbing an owl or something. You'll just feel it, and it's not something that you have to intellectualize about in order to make sense of what's happening there. It's just your mind stays quiet. I hope that makes sense. Having a quiet mind in the forest and yet still having access to all that knowledge of identification is a totally different experience than going into the forest and being surrounded by mysteries. Not that there won't still be mysteries, because that's the thing. The further out you go, the more you realize there's actually more mysteries out there. There's more subtle mysteries out there, and there's different mysteries further out. So you'll never run out of things to occupy your attention. But in order for your attention to move on to new discoveries and new explorations and new mysteries, you have to really integrate the most common and the most basic things first, and get them to the point where you can do it without thinking about it. So I encourage you to choose one bird in your area. What do you think is the most common bird in your area? It might be the robin, it might be a chickadee, it might be some kind of sparrow, but just pick one and go to, say, MacaulayLibrary.org and look up the sounds for that bird and see if you actually do know that bird. Can you actually recognize all the sounds that bird makes? And they have like hundreds of recordings for every bird, so it takes a little bit of time to just sort of dig through, and you'll recognize, like, okay, I've heard that sound before, I've heard that sound before. And if you heard these sounds in the forest, would you know that it's a chickadee? And would you have to think about it? If you wouldn't know that it's a chickadee, and if you do have to think about it, then you don't know that bird yet. And so grab some of those recordings and just listen to them over and over and over again. It is worthwhile if it takes you a month of just listening to one bird's sounds in order to really get it integrated in your sensory memory. It's worth it. And you could just do one bird a month, and in one season you will know the most common birds in your area, and you'll have them at that deep level. The final step is once you spend all that time listening, then you want to go out and you want to follow that up with time in the field and find that bird in the field and see if you can hear all its different sounds in the field. And then notice how that changes your experience when you go outside and you hear that bird in the forest. And let me know how that goes. Let me know if you have any questions about any of this, and I will see you in the next video. Go choose one bird and learn it backwards.